Okay, so we'll get started. This is hopefully a book in progress, and I'll tell you a little bit more about that. But it's very much in the very beginning stages in some ways. So this thing's not totally polished by any stretch, but I think we can have some fun. So not that long ago, this picture was taken. The third graders got their Bibles. And of course, there are always some that aren't there that day, and we do it at 2 services. But I don't know what your experience is. I always think it's really cute. That's not a bad word to say. It's very cute, and it's a great ritual. They're given a Bible, they're readers by that point, and we give them a Bible and so forth. But I also have reactions to it. So Paul Ricoeur, and I think this picture sort of fits who he was. He famously described 2 approaches to interpreting anything. So the first one is called the hermeneutics of reception. It's a fancy term for, I'm open to that. I'm going to see what I can take from this. Isn't that great? Third graders got their Bible. That's so lovely. That's a hermeneutics of reception. A hermeneutics of suspicion says, you think any of them will ever read it? And for me, I experience both of them. I sit there going, this is so great. They can read. They've just gotten their own Bible. Their parents got the iPhones out, recording it. And then I'm thinking, yeah, that's the book they will never read. It might still be in cellophane when they graduate or whatever. So I do have both hermeneutics operating. And I use that as a kind of metaphor to get into this. I think of this class over the 2 weeks as a kind of combination of both. I'm hoping that I can help them / us on how to read the Bible. And I don't know exactly, the wording I used is worried about how best to defend why we should read the Bible. And that's what I'm going to do next week, and it's definitely the hardest thing. And it's also a strange thing to even try, is if this is going to be a book, you can't write a book called Why You Should Read the Bible if somebody's not interested in reading the Bible in the first place. Because whatever arguments you have that would convince them, they're not even going to pick it up. So I'm having this weird circular argument in my head about it. But I'm going to hope that even if you love reading the Bible, that next week I can sort of convince you even more. And if you're hesitant, I can convince you. So anyway, this is a kind of work in progress, and it's been going on for years. David May and I started, years ago, we read Thomas Foster's book, How to Read Literature Like a Professor. And we were really taken with it. If you love literature, you'd love this book. It's really clever, it's creative, it's fun, it's just a good read. And then we started using it in seminary, actually, to make analogies with, the techniques that this person's using to read Mark Twain could be used to read Gospels. There really are carryovers. And we'll talk about some of that here in a minute. And then I wrote an introduction and a couple of chapters of this book. And David wrote some. Then we said, well, why don't we co-write it? And so we started doing that, and we would kind of submit chapters and work on it together. And it's gone, I wouldn't say it's gone nowhere, but we've let it sit, right? And we've got other projects going. But for me, lately, I've been more enamored with the idea of why instead of how. Partly because there's a bunch of how books out there, good ones, that I'll mention as we go. But I'm just really intrigued by the why, and I'm not sure exactly how to explain it. So anyway, we're going to try tonight. We'll talk about how. Next week, we'll talk about why. Okay, so we're going to start with how. This is just a sampling of the different critical methodologies you can use to read the Bible. And the best way to read it is to use all of these simultaneously. Okay, simultaneously is not the right word. You use this one, you use that one, you do this one, you use that one. But these are all good. Historical, that one's pretty obvious, right? What was going on? What's in the background? What's the context? What was this army that was attacking this king in the Bible? Grammatical, the Hebrew or Greek. I was reading a book today that was doing stuff with the languages, Greek and Hebrew. And it's It's incredible how it opens up the passage because it wasn't written in English. Form, you probably haven't heard much about this, but it makes perfect sense. By the time Genesis gets written down, we don't know who wrote it, you can imagine that it's been told many, many times orally. How long, we don't know. But we know the Gospels, for instance, that Jesus lived in the 30s, and that the earliest Gospel wasn't written until the 70s. So we got 40 years there. And we know that those stories were passed along. Now, we don't have any audio tapes, right? We don't have any record of it, but we know that that was how it was done. We know there were storytellers that told these, and eventually somebody that we call Mark, it's an anonymous book, but somebody we call Mark took those, wrote a thing called the Gospel, and then the others came along. So form criticism says, well, what shape do you think it was in before it got written down? And how do you think it might have been changed? So that's a critical methodology. And there are people who are, in each one of these, there are experts who've given their whole life to that way of reading. Social science, that's David Mays, who was here a couple weeks ago doing coins. Coins would fall into, in a way, social science. In a way, historical context and culture. But social science looks at cultures and customs that help you understand the times, right? Cultures are different. Feminist critical methodology. It's amazing to me. I'm a white male. I pick up a feminist commentary on the Beatitudes or on some story and I go, I in my entire life would have never seen that. But this woman has seen this. And so it's another set of eyes. Same thing for post-colonial. Colonial is the notion that, well, you know what colonial is, but post-colonial would be, well, what would it mean to read through the eyes of the poor instead of the people who won the war? Right? The victors get to tell it. Well, what would it mean to read it from the bottom? And then another one, there are many others, by the way, literary, which is a really fun one. In the Gospels, for instance, sometimes there'll be a story in which it said, and the crowds did this, and the people said such and such. And you just read, right? But the literary critic goes, now this is interesting because he's made a distinction here between the people and the crowds. And you go, what? Yeah, look, crowds, people. And then you start reading through that whole gospel and look at all the times they use the word crowds and you go, oh, so the crowds in this gospel, here's the way they act. And the people, they act differently. Or the disciples, they have this role. And so it's looking at the kind of stuff that your English teacher told you to look at in Shakespeare, but the writers, they're writers, and so they tell stories. So there's all of these methodologies, but the one that I want to focus on, because I'm using this analogy or this metaphor of the library, is called rhetorical criticism. It's built on several notions, three that I'll just mention. One is access to those early forms that I was talking about. We don't have it. It's highly speculative. What did the stories of creation or the stories of Tower of Babel, what did that look like before it got written down this way? Who knows? How can you be an expert in that when you don't know? Well, there's things they do, but it's still speculative. So that one's a little bit speculative. It's fun to imagine, and there are people in the history of Judaism and Christianity who said, it's really a shame that they got written down. Now, and your reaction to that, you chuckled. You know why you chuckled? Because you don't understand oral culture. The reason that they said it was a shame was because then there was one version. And before that, this storyteller said it this way, this storyteller said it this way, and that made it a really dynamic process. But as people who are literate, we go, man, we wouldn't even have them if they hadn't written down. And they would have said, no, you'd had so many more. So it's interesting to play the game of what was it like. The second thing is the biblical authors were products of their time and their culture. So they are influenced by how other literature was being written at the time. We don't know anything about these writers. All these works are anonymous in the Bible. They are anonymous. We've put names to them, but they are anonymous. we don't know anything about them except we know they're writers.
We do know Paul.
Well, yeah. I was thinking more of the narratives, yeah. Yeah, we do have Paul, and then we, of course, have people that use the name of Paul. Yeah, so these writers, though, they're influenced by the other writers of the culture, even other religious writers. And so they borrowed literary forms, which is what we'll look at tonight. So in addition to what a text says, we can study how it says it. And this is a kind of interesting premise. I don't know if it's going to be as earth-shattering for you as it was for me, but when I was in doctoral studies, one of my mentors, Tom Long, he wrote this little book, and I remember where I was when I was reading it because it was like scales fell off my eyes. It was the notion that a text doesn't just say something, it does something, and that the form that it comes in is as important as the contents. Now, we don't think that way with regards to bread. You go to the store and you buy a loaf of bread. It comes in a box, right? No, it comes in a bag. If it came in a box, would it bother you? Probably. Yeah, it'd be more expensive. And if milk came in a bag, you'd be like, well, now that's weird. It's supposed to be in a carton, or whatever. We don't really think about it, but the form, the envelope into which they put the contents is just as important when it comes to the Bible because it's a piece of literature. So you'll get the premise here. I'll read you an example that he gives. This is from Tom Long. Okay, so once upon a time, there was a man who lived in a small village. Though his home was humble and his life simple, he was a collector of fine clocks. And people would travel for many miles to see his rare and wonderful collection. His clocks were indeed splendid, but none was more magnificent than the one which he called the angel clock. It was a very old clock, but no one, not even him, knew just when it was made or the circumstances of its creation. Its base was fine silver, the figures on its face, precious stones. Rising from its top was an angel made from pure gold. Each quarter hour is marked of the tone of a flawless chime, and at each hour the clock sounded music so lovely that the man believed it was the very music of heaven. One night, while he was sleeping, a thief entered his home, and when the thief departed, he carried with him only one of the man's possessions. It was the angel clock. The end. And you go, what? That's not the end, right? Why is it not the end? Because when you started with Once Upon a Time, it was like saying milk comes in a carton, bread comes in a bag. But then when I said the end, you said, whoa, you just put the milk in a bag, right? Or the bread in a box. Because it violated the form. The form Once Upon a Time says, not only will there be the end at the end, which it does, but in the middle, there'll not only be conflict, which there is, there'll be resolution, right? Every story has that formula. Okay, so then he says, let's see if I can find it. Where is he? Okay, here's the follow-up. Associated Press. Littleton police reported yesterday that William Archer, a local resident collector of antique clocks, was the victim of a burglary Tuesday night. The thief apparently entered the home while Archer was sleeping. Only one item, a valuable clock, was reported missing, and he goes through the entire set of details that we already covered. And then it just says, police sources indicate there are no suspects at the present. And that's the end of the piece. And you don't say, what? That's not, you know that that's the way a report works in this case. It's unsolved mystery at this point. So this form thing and content go together. The newspaper is a very dated reference nowadays, but if you open a newspaper, you don't read the want ads the same way you read political cartoons, the same way you read the sports report. There are rules to the genres on the page. And as a kid, you don't know what those are, but you learn them. And then they just become second nature. You don't look at the political cartoon and go, well, now, since when can an elephant talk, or whatever. You know the genre. And it's the same. This one's an interesting one, the church's hymns. Did you know that in the back of the hymnal, there's an index that has the meter of all the hymns, and you can take some hymns and sing it to a different tune. Okay, now I see a lot of heads shaking. A secular example is you can sing Amazing Grace to the House of the Rising Sun and to the theme of Gilligan's Island. The meter fits. Doesn't really fit the mood, or as the one I used to use as an example. Do you remember the hymn that goes, I was sinking deep in sin, far from the peaceful shore? Well,
You must have been a Baptist.
that hymn, you hear it, it sounds like I'm playing a calliope. But listen to the words. I was sinking deep in sin, far from the peaceful shore. The feel of that should not sound like a calliope at the carnival. It's not a good, what they call marriage of text and tune. So musicians talk about the marriage of text and tune in the hymnal. And they would even argue that some of the hymns in the hymnal are set to the wrong tune. And you can use the index to adjust it. So it just drives home the point of the form and the content go together.
Didn't we have one Sunday that was not what we usually sing
Yes,
to that
yes.
tune?
Yeah, we do it
And-
sometimes.
I mean, I know we do, but I mean, there was one Sunday that I kept saying the wrong words because they were,
Yeah.
you know,
Yeah, because your brain's trained.
right.
Right.
My brain knew the other song better
Right.
than this one.
Right. Okay, so what sort of books do we find in libraries? Well, I find it interesting, maybe you do, maybe you don't, that the world has decided to divide books between fiction and nonfiction as opposed to historical and non-historical. Or, I don't know what word you want to use, happening and not happening, made up and, whatever. But we decided to define history and cooking and music and all of these things as not fiction. So we've made fiction this defining kind of thing, which is kind of interesting. But we have all these categories, right? So if you go to the library and you say to the librarian, I'm looking for a mystery novel, they'll take you to the fiction, they'll take you to the mystery. Maybe you're looking for a certain author, they'll take you there. Nonfiction, you can go to all of these types. You can look online. It's incredibly complicated. The Library of Congress has just tremendous page after page on the rules for how to catalog these things. Okay, but no one expects all the books to agree with each other. Why would you? You wouldn't even expect all of the ones in history to agree with each other. And that's history. So the point, of course, being that for some reason we do in the Bible. So what sort of books do we find in, and I put the books in quotation marks here, and the Bible in quotation marks, because as it turns out, the words the Bible in Greek mean literally the books, plural, not singular. So we really shouldn't be calling it the Bible. If we were going to call it Bible, we should call it the Bibles or the books. But we call it the Bible. It's a misnomer. It's a total misnomer.
What's
Okay.
the Greek word?
Ta biblia. Yeah, the books. Biblion would be singular, but biblia is plural. Okay, so what kind of books do we find in the books called the books? Well, we got these two things that we've called testaments, and the first one is in the Hebrew is called the Tanakh. So your Jewish friends would call their Bible the Tanakh. And that's just a little acrostic. The T and the N and the K are the first letters of the three parts. The Torah, or the law, or maybe better, the teachings. The Nevim, or the prophets. And then the Ketuvim, or the writings. Our Bible has those three parts, but not in that order. Our Bible has the law, the writings, and then the prophets. A little bit of difference there. The New Testament, what kind of books do you have there? You have gospel books, you have one Acts, you have epistles, bunch of epistles, and you have one Apocalypse. So these are the kinds of books you would find in our library called the books. Okay, in the West, we've expected all parts of this one book to say the same thing. And that has really messed us up. Now, there's a whole cottage industry that's benefited from it. They're called apologists. And they write books to defend how every verse does agree with every other verse. But they have to do a lot of gymnastics to get there. And sometimes you'll kind of go, "Ooh, that's a little bit weak there, buddy. I don't know how you quite got that." because this verse and this verse do not say the same thing. And I'm not really sure why they feel the need to do that, but they do. So that's an ancient practice. As far back as the 2nd century, there's a thing called the diatessaron. It wasn't trying to do that. It wasn't trying to make them all say the same thing, the way apologists do now. But they did want to harmonize the Gospels. They wanted to have one story, 2nd century. But here's just an example. Jesus in the Gospels chastises, you may remember this story, James and John, because they asked for the special seats when Jesus comes into his kingdom. And in Matthew, the mother of James and John makes the request. In Mark, they make the request. So these apologists, they have to go to work. They go, well, probably what happened, and you hear it, I'm going to rescue the texts, plural. What I'm going to say is probably the mother approached, and then they went up, or vice versa. The sons had come up, and then the mom came, and Matthew told it this way, and Mark told it this way, and then the example I used here is this analogy that, well, if you have 4 people on a street corner and they witness a wreck, they'll see it differently. But of course, none of these people witnessed the Gospels. They had stories that they took in, and so they shaped them, and they have reasons for doing it. And again, in the West, we think, oh, this is a little bit troubling. But that's not a problem at all in the Eastern mindset. They wouldn't have any problem with conflictual versions of the story. Mostly because, remember that 40 years of telling it, they would have had versions of it. It doesn't bother them. And this is an innocent one. There's sometimes where they make a theological change. I'll give you an example. We should read each book on its own. But when we make comparisons and contrasts, Matthew versus Mark, we're doing it to try and figure out, well, then why does Matthew do this? Instead of saying, well, let me see if I can fix it. What was the purpose of doing it this way versus that way? Or the example I've given here, it's probably been a while since you've made your way through 1st and 2nd Chronicles or 1st and 2nd Kings, but they tell the exact same history. But in Chronicles, David comes off looking good, and in Kings, not so good. Those are different theological/political stances that the writers have taken. One's going to do some hagiography, make David into the great king. The other's going to say, well, not exactly. This is what he did. We want to read these books on their own merits. So I'm inviting us to walk through the library called the Bible. And we're going to walk around and we're going to pick off different ones off the shelf, different passages, and we're going to look at them. And we're going to look at 7 passages, one from each of these 7 genres here. So let me make one more distinction here. It's terminology. I'm not always hard and fast about making this distinction, but most of the time this is the distinction that's made. Genre will be a large literary type, like a gospel. But form, the literary form that's used, might be something like a parable. So within the gospel genre, there's all kinds of forms. One of them's a parable. One of them's a pronouncement story. One of them's a miracle story. These are literary forms within the genre called gospel. And then the smaller subset would be the devices that they use. Parables sometimes use hyperbole. The woman was baking bread and she took 3 measures of flour, which is like 60 pounds. Well, that's hyperbole. No woman in the 1st century is making enough bread for hundreds of people, if not more. So there's hyperbole that goes on. There's the rule of 3 that's used in parables. We still use the rule of 3 when we tell jokes, right? The Irishman, the Englishman, and whatever goes into the bar. And you got to wait for the 3rd one to get the punchline. Well, parables operate on that principle. It's a very ancient principle, still used. Comedians will use it tonight somewhere and stand up. It's always been around. Okay, so you with me? You good?
Is apologetics just a New Testament activity, or there are apologetics in the Old Testament?
No, there's apologetics everywhere.
Okay.
Yeah, yeah. And they'll even do stuff like, you have to believe Moses wrote the first 5 books because it says so at the top of the page. But the page was written by an English publisher.
Yeah, and the typesetters.
Yeah, I mean, there's no signed, other than, like you mentioned, Paul's letters. His name even appears in them. But, yeah, these were anonymous works. Yeah, but they do rescue lots of Old Testament issues. But, you pick them up and you read them on your own and you go, well, look, Job says there's this guy, he's like blameless, which tells you already we're using hyperbole. There's no such person. And he's blameless and he's going to suffer. And in the book of Deuteronomy, and the writers of Deuteronomy say, well, the reason you're suffering is because you disobeyed God. And the book of Job says, well, there's another way to look at suffering. And so they're doing what people have always done. They're wrestling with, what does it mean to be a follower of God? What is this God like? And nobody sits down for an interview. They're writers. Okay, so here's a Torah reading. I'll bet you know this one. In the beginning, when God created the heavens and the earth was a formless void, and darkness covered the face of the deep, while a wind from God swept over the face of the waters. Then God said, let there be light. And there was light. And God saw that the light was good, and God separated the light from the darkness. God called the light day, and the darkness he called night. And there was evening, and there was morning, the first day. Okay, so I'm really tempted to do about 10 methodologies there, but we're going to limit ourselves to the rhetorical criticism. We're going to limit ourselves to the kind of literature that we're reading. So this comes from the Torah, and that's a very flexible genre. It's mostly stories, but it's not exclusively, because Torah covers 5 whole books, right? So it's going to include Exodus, it's going to include Leviticus, it's going to include Numbers, it's going to include the 10 Commandments in there. So you're going to have lots of flexibility within that. The form, though, that's used here is a borrowed form from ancient Near Eastern mythologies. Lots of writers at the time told creation stories. It was the kind of thing ancient peoples did. How in the world did this thing exist? And there's formulas for writing these. Now, the biblical writers adapt some of these. They don't just wholesale do them. They don't copy them. They kind of make changes to them, and I'll show you as we go. But one literary device is that of call and response. So let me just show you a couple of things here. The characteristics of mythologies. There are no historical persons or institutions present. You keep reading in Genesis, and it's going to be the story of these first 2 people. And the first guy is called Dusty, because he's made out of the dust. Okay, he's called Adam because he's made out of the Adamah. Well, if your character's called out of the dust, it's not exact. I mean, I know we got people named Adam now, right? I have a good friend named Adam. And then we're going to call the woman the mother of living things. Well, you kind of get the idea. Well, is this a person, or is this kind of symbolic here? You're also going to get a snake that talks. That's a pretty good signal that we're in mythology. I've never heard of a snake that talks. And I love the definition of mythology is that it may not be true on the outside, but you know it's true on the inside. And what they're getting at is, don't get caught up in the details of it. Get to the heart of what is it saying. What is the story trying to tell us? And then I think one of the things that the rhetorical critics would say is it demonstrates God's covenant with the created order. And here's why I say that. It uses call and response. So we can't see this. Well, we can see it in English, but it's easier to see it in Hebrew. Okay, so rather than declarative, it uses permissive. Let there be. How else could it have been? It could have been, what?
There was.
There be.
Yeah. Instead it says, well, let there be light. That's a very interesting way to say the creation story. Let there be. And then there was. The creation is going to cooperate with God as it comes into being. And it's kind of like what we do at least at 10 and 11 on Sundays when we have a call to worship. We don't do one at 9:01, but at 10 and 11 we have some person says, we gather this day as, and then we say a line. That's what's going on in Genesis, and this poetry is going to repeat it over 6 days. Yeah?
If you went back to the original language instead of English, does all of that still hold true?
What do you mean, does that?
To let there be?
Yes, yes, yeah. Yeah. Yeah, they've done a good job there. Yeah, and then, this rhetorical criticism, mythology also, what's the first thing that's going to be created? Light. But a couple days later, God creates the sun and the moon. So you go, well, now, what was this thing called light? Well, it was light. It's poetry, so you say it was light. What do you mean? Well, the person who's saying, well, what do you mean, is not in the poetry class, right? They're in the history class. You forgot, we're in poetry class. And the poet says, God created light. It's the first thing God creates. And lots of other insights here, but you get the idea. We're looking at the kind of literature that we're dealing with. What kind of book have we pulled off the shelf when we open it to Genesis 1 and start reading? We've pulled off some poetry. We've pulled off some mythology. It's going to use a call and response to tell the creation story. And there's so much more going on there. There's beautiful rhyme going on, and there's symmetry. There's going to be 3 days here and 3 days here. And the 6 days are then set apart from that 7th when God rests. It's just beautiful stuff. So if you wander into the library and you go, oh my gosh, I guess I'm in the poetry section, well, it's going to be different than if you had said, I'm looking for a book on how to build a deck. Right? That's not here. They might have a poem about the deck, but it's not going to tell you how to build one. It's going to use some metaphor of something. Okay, yeah.
Going back to that last slide, when you said, well, not true on the outside, very true on the inside, is that like the spiritualism of the Indians when they would say, I don't know if this has really happened, but this is how it was?
Yes.
But this is true. But this is, yeah.
Yeah.
I don't know if this is really true, but this is how it happened.
Yeah. I raised one of my kids every night at bedtime. She went on to be the religion major. She said I had to every night tell her a Bible story that she'd never heard. Yes. And then make up a story. So we did it every night. And what I remember is she would say, is that story true? And I said, it's the wrong question. What you mean to say is, did it really happen? All stories are true, Melissa. All stories are true. And that's the basic idea here of mythology is all stories are true. Did it happen? That's a different question. And that's what's gotten a lot of trouble with people reading Genesis and trying to reconcile it with science, because they're expecting it to agree with science. But you don't go into the library and pull off a book of poetry to do science. You go to the science section. And they're not irreconcilable at all. There's some really good work where people say you can totally reconcile these things. But you got to remember, poetry is not science, and science isn't poetry. All right, so a prophet reading, a reading from the Navim, right? This one was read just a week ago Sunday, except we only read one verse of it. So here's the context. Hear what the Lord says. Rise, plead your case before the mountains, and let the hills hear your voice. Hear, you mountains, the controversy of the Lord, and you enduring foundations of the earth. For the Lord has a controversy with his people, and he will contend with Israel. O my people, what have I done to you? And what have I wearied you? Answer me. For I brought you up from the land of Egypt, and redeemed you from the house of slavery, and I sent before you Moses, Aaron, and Miriam. O my people, remember now what King Balak of Moab devised, what Balaam son of Beor answered him, and what happened from Shittim to Gilgal, that you may know the saving acts of the Lord. With what shall I come before the Lord and bow myself before God on high? Shall I come before him with burnt offerings, with calves a year old? Will the Lord be pleased with thousands of rams, with tens of thousands of rivers of oil? Shall I give my firstborn for my transgression, the fruit of my body for the sin of my soul. He has told you, O mortal, what is good. And what does the Lord require of you but to do justice and to love kindness and to walk humbly with your God? So we hear that verse a lot. We don't always hear the context. So let's look at the context. Okay, in terms of genre, it's prophetic literature. We know that. But what we have to remind ourselves immediately is the genre called prophetic literature, we're in the library and we went to the prophets, is not about predicting. It's not about foretelling, predicting the future. It's about speaking to the present. The prophets rose up to speak to the kings. That's their whole task, is to speak to the powers that be about injustice, primarily economic injustice. So we need to remember that when we go into the library and we pick off something from the prophets. That's probably going to be what they talk about, 9 times out of 10. In terms of form, this one has 2. And you can kind of see it if you think about it. There's a trial scene. You heard that at the very beginning, right? Did you catch that? I'll go back. Plead your case before the mountains. So creation is going to be the witnesses, the jury here. And hear you mountains, the controversy of the Lord. So we have a trial scene. But the other part that we get is an entrance liturgy. And you can see that one too. So in ancient Israel, as you went up to the temple, there were songs that you sang. And the priest, it's very much the ancient equivalent to our call to worship. The priest would say a line and the people would say a line. They may have sung it, they may have said it and chanted it. And that's what's going on here. With what shall I come before the Lord and bow myself before God? And they would say all this, and then the priest would respond. And the response, of course, is verse 8. What does God require of you? So we get 2 forms that are kind of blended together here. In terms of device, we get call and response yet again. So there's a participation here in the text. Okay, questions? I'm going to keep going if not, because we got a ways to go. Okay, here's a reading from the writings. This one's really fun. I love this one. This is Psalm 1. Happy are those who do not follow the advice of the wicked, or take the path that sinners tread, or sit in the seat of scoffers. But their delight is in the law of the Lord, and on his law they meditate day and night. They're like trees planted by streams of water, which yield their fruit in its season, and their leaves do not wither. In all that they do, they prosper. The wicked are not so, but are like chaff that the wind drives away. Therefore the wicked will not stand in the judgment, nor sinners in the congregation of the righteous. The Lord watches over the way of the righteous, but the way of the wicked will perish. Okay, so what kind of literature do we have? Well, we know it's a psalm, and that word, it's a Greek word, but that word can refer to a piece of poetry, can refer to a hymn. The Psalms probably have more prayers in it than they do hymns, although growing up we kind of call it the hymn book. It's probably got more prayers than hymns in it, but it's kind of what we would nowadays call a prayer book that has hymns in it. And there are some examples. Our denomination doesn't publish one of those, but there are examples of those out there. So we know that we've gone back into the poetry section, or maybe the music section. In terms of form, this one's called a wisdom psalm. There's all kinds of psalms. A wisdom psalm is there to teach you how to live. And there's another criticism methodology. Canonical critics talk about what order have things been put in. So they will say, well, if they took 150 of these things and put this one first, it's there for a good reason. This is to stand over all of the Psalms and say, here is how to live. Here's the wisdom, here's how to live. And then I just love the way this thing's put together. It's just brilliant. It's the poetry's verbs and imagery. Now you caught the imagery, right? There's chaff and there's a tree. Well, that's pretty low-hanging fruit, right? It's not hard to catch that. The righteous, they're like this firmly planted tree by the water, leaves growing. Chaff, it's not a very pleasant image. You know that one's pretty obvious, right? You don't have to be a poet, critic, or anything like that. But the verbs are so interesting. So look back at the verbs. Follow the advice, take the path, sit. I'm going to skip down. The wind drives away, verse 4. They'll not stand in the judgment. Okay, so it's really hard to follow this because of the way they use in the negative. The righteous have no verbs except one. Because notice, they don't do these things. They don't follow. They don't take the path. They don't sit in the seat. They just delight and meditate. The verbs in the poem have the righteous as a tree, but the verbs say there's just this stillness. They're just there. But the wicked have all the verbs. The wicked do these things. They follow the advice, they take the path, they sit in the seat, and they're blown about. So even in English, if you do what the poetry teachers taught you to do, you go, oh, it's not just tree and chaff. The verbs, they have the wicked running all around. And the righteous are just sitting there.
The righteous are planted and the wicked perish.
Yeah, exactly. So isn't that beautiful? And it's just another example of how they've borrowed a literary form. Okay, so New Testament. A reading from the Gospels. As Jesus went ashore, he saw a great crowd and he had compassion for them because they were like sheep without a shepherd. And he began to teach them many things. When it grew late, his disciples came to him and said, "This is a deserted place and the hour is now very late. Send them away so they may go into the surrounding country and villages and buy something for themselves to eat." But he answered them, "You give them something to eat." They said to him, "Are we to go buy 200 denarii worth of bread and give it them to eat?" And he said to them, "How many loaves have you? Go and see." When they'd found out, they said, 5 and 2 fish. Then he ordered them to get all the people to sit down in groups on the green grass. So they sat down in groups of hundreds and fifties. Taking the 5 loaves and the 2 fish, he looked up to heaven and blessed and broke the loaves and gave them to his disciples to set before the people. And he divided the 2 fish among them all. And all ate and were filled. And they took up 12 baskets full of broken pieces and of the fish. Those who had eaten the loaves numbered 5,000 men. So that's the Mark 6:34 to 44 version. Okay, so what kind of, before I even flip over, what do you notice from a rhetorical criticism standpoint? Anything?
Talking about men, not people.
Talk about men, not people. Yeah.
The fact that it's improbable that they would have anything left over after 5 loaves and 2 fish for 5,000 people.
Yeah, it's very improbable if we'd gone to the science section.
Yes.
Right.
it's on the set sign.
Right. Unless everybody got the tiniest little piece. But, that's
Then
not
they would
realistic.
be full.
Yeah, they wouldn't be full though.
Picnics, they came prepared.
Okay, so in terms of genre, Gospels, we went to the Gospel section. Gospels are a unique literary form. There was no such thing exactly when Mark wrote. There were sort of things like it, and it's sort of a hodgepodge. It's got a little bit of ancient biography, it's got a little bit of history, but it's not exactly a biography, it's not exactly a history, it's different from the others. It's definitely a storytelling approach. We know that, it's a narrative approach. And we also know that the word gospel was used by Rome as a way to talk about imperial victories. Well, now that's interesting because Rome's on the throne and we're going to tell a history of somebody else and we're going to call it a gospel. So it's a kind of interesting genre. It's got a bunch of forms in it, but this one's a miracle story. Okay, so miracle stories, the very word, the words miracle story are the key. Miracle stories are not about the miracle, they're about the story. If they were about the miracle, they would read so differently. Where is the attention in the story? when the moment happens, when the magic happens, there's nothing said about it. If you were the science person or the journalist, you're going to write the history of this thing, you would have said, and then I'm telling you, he took the bread and you would describe some kind of detail of this miracle. But of the verses that they use, and they use a lot of verses to tell this story, there's no attention given to that. The attention is given to people who are hungry, disciples who say, where are we going to get food? You give them something to eat. And, of course, to a lot of literary details. There's echoes of Psalm 23 here. There's green grass. They're by the water. They're sit down on the green grass. I mean, we're probably, and they're like sheep without a shepherd, it describes earlier. There's a lot of stuff going on along those lines. But you also get, in this literary device, you get the language of the Last Supper used in the wilderness. He's going to take bread and bless and break it and give it to them. Well, we're supposed to go, now I've heard those words before. Where have I heard those words before? But that's a literary device. That's a rhetorical device. Hmm?
It's also, in a sense, a parable about the feeding. It's not about the food, but about what Jesus has taught and what, he's there teaching them. And then he's asking the disciples to continue that teaching.
Yeah. Yeah, it has a little bit of a parable to it. The difference being the parables are kind of made-up stories. This one's taking a more of an event kind of approach. Okay, how about a reading from the Acts? When the 14th night had come, as we were drifting across the Sea of Adria, about midnight the sailors suspected they were nearing land. So they took soundings and found 20 fathoms. A little farther on, they took soundings again and found 15 fathoms. If you're at sea, that's a bad sign, right? Maybe. Fearing that we might run on the rocks, they let down 4 anchors from the stern and prayed for day to come. But when the sailors tried to escape from the ship and had lowered the boat into the sea on the pretext of putting out anchors from the bow, Paul said to the centurion and the soldiers, "Unless these men stay in the ship, you cannot be saved." Then the soldiers cut away the ropes of the boat and set it adrift. Just before daybreak, Paul urged all of them to take some food, saying, "Today is the 14th day that you've been in suspense and remaining without food, having eaten nothing. Therefore I urge you to take some food, for it will help you survive, for none of you will lose a hair from your heads." After he'd said this, he took bread, giving thanks to God in the presence of all, he broke it and began to eat. Then all of them were encouraged and took food for themselves. We were in all 276 persons in the ship. Okay, it's probably been a while since you've read that story. You have to trudge all the way to near the end of Acts to get to it. So, an axe, I'm going to use that word, an axe, A-C-T-S, not A-X-E, is a literary style popular at the time. There were a bunch of them written. Bunches of them. One made it into the Bible. And so ours is sometimes called the Acts of the Apostles, or the Acts of the Holy Spirit. But these are labels we gave it, but there were a bunch of these things called Acts. The Greek word is just praxis. There were a bunch of praxis. All right, so, and it's kind of an interesting literary form. It's sort of history, but it's got a lot of adventure in it. So they're not writing the history of Country Club Christian Church, because in writing this history, they're going to take a little bit of liberty here and there, and they're going to sort of spice it up a little bit. It's an adventure story. In terms of form, we have nothing really brilliant about this, right? It's a travel adventure at sea. Well, what do you expect with a travel adventure at sea? Well, you do know one thing. If you read back in Genesis, that from the very beginning on the first page, the waters, place of chaos. That's what God is presiding over, and divides the waters from the waters from above and the waters from below, and puts this land mass there. And of course, all through the Bible, the water's place of chaos. It's the place where storms come up on the Sea of Galilee. It's a place of chaos. So you don't have to be a literary critic to realize, we've picked up a swashbuckler here. We're going to sea, we're going to smell the salt, we're going to taste it, the wind's going to blow, the sails are flapping in the wind. I grew up sailing, and I was caught in some big storms, and one of them probably could have killed me, except this other bigger ship came along and took us in. So, sea adventure is really great when you're not in it. It's great on the screen. It's scary as can be in real life. You do not know if you're going to make it. And I don't think there's monsters in there. I just know you can die. So that's what's at stake here when we read this story. And that's what's so missing, because we don't realize we've walked into the library called Bible and we've gone into a sea adventure, as opposed to the way I started when I started reading the Bible was, well, then, it's just, this is history. Well, yeah, but it's history, but they're ramping it up with some adventure here. And I loved those kind of stories on TV, but I didn't think that the Bible could have those. Did you? Yeah.
Yeah, well, when Paul is talking about, don't get out of the boat,
Mhm.
stay here, and, so how did he know to do that? Why is he saying that?
Well, that's God's directing him to say that. And the boat, literary criticism, not rhetorical criticism, a boat in the New Testament is a symbol of the church.
Okay.
So Paul's saying, let me put it this way, not Paul, the writer that we call Luke, it's an anonymous work, but the writer of the second volume that we call Acts, Luke, he's telling a story about a boat and the storm, and Paul, speaking on behalf of God, says, and actually the word, it says survive, it's saved in Greek. Staying in the church is going to be your salvation in the midst of this storm you're facing that's called the Roman Empire. That's what's going on the literary side. On the rhetorical side, you have this device, again, did you hear it? The language of the Last Supper. It's kind of hard to miss. But this is fascinating, because in the gospel you get this story of Jesus and the crowds. Now you've got pagan sailors and Roman centurion and soldiers. And all of these people are going to eat this meal. That's pretty radical stuff. Okay, we got 2 more to go. I'm going to have to get with it here. Okay, reading from the epistles. It's from early in Romans. Since they did not see fit to acknowledge God, God gave them up to a debased mind and to things that should not be done. They were filled with every kind of wickedness, evil, covetousness, malice, full of envy, murder, strife, deceit, craftiness. They are gossips, slanderers, God-haters, insolent, haughty, boastful, inventors of evil, rebellious toward parents, foolish, faithless, heartless, ruthless. That's not on a Hallmark card. This is an interesting device. It's a very common one. So let me just kind of put it in context. In terms of genre, we know we're in an epistle. Epistle is a fancy word, but it really is kind of a needed word. There are occasional letters, in this case used by Paul, but others, to address pastoral concerns within a community. So they're occasional. They are written in response to something that's going on, and they're sent out. And these were written by all kinds of people in the first century. People wrote epistles. But Paul made some changes. Epistles typically said greetings in Greek. Paul changed that to grace and peace. Little changes like that. And so we know a little bit about epistles. Okay, in terms of form, though, what he's done here is borrow a form called vice and virtue lists. In this case, it's all vices. But you know the one in Galatians, sometimes called the fruit of the Spirit and the deeds of the flesh? That's a vice and virtue list. They're common throughout the Pauline epistles. Do not, but instead put on, do this, do this, do this. They're listing behaviors to avoid and behaviors to emulate. Very common form in the first century. This one, though, is fascinating. Of the 21 terms listed, the first 9 describe economic injustice resulting in violence. The next 3 describe deceit linked to economic oppression. The next 3 describe superior economic status. and then 3 describe an ethos of injustice. Paul, it's in the name of the book, Romans. He's describing how Rome's elite live. This is his description of how Rome's elite live. 21 words he will use to say it. And it's all about economic oppression and injustice. So then, the device, though, is fascinating. I don't have time to, and I didn't even put it on the slide. Almost all of the words rhyme in Greek. And there's a bunch of them that are alliterated. You get this little section of all of them start with M. This one, all of these start with A. These all start with, and it's a brilliant literary device. And this wasn't something Paul invented. Others did it because it was an oral culture. Only 2% of the population could read. So when letters, epistles came to communities, Christian or otherwise, they would be read by somebody who could read. And you're hearing this, and you got a better chance of memorizing and taking it in if there's a rhyme scheme to it and there's alliteration. And I'll never forget when I think it was Jehovah's Witnesses girls came around and they knocked on my door and they said, "Do you mind if we talk to you about something?" And I said, "Well, I'm a Bible scholar. Do you really want to do this?" And they said, "Oh, yeah, no, that's okay, but anyway." And then she said, "Well, can I ask you a question?" I go, "Well, sure." And she said, "What's one thing that you learned from your studies?" And I thought, well, that's a really good question. And I said, the thing that's really blown me away is how much rhyme there is in the New Testament that's hidden from our ears because we don't read Greek. And she goes, "What do you mean?" And I started giving her examples. In the Lord's Prayer, it's rhyming. In the Vice and Virtue list, there's rhymes. And she appreciated that, and they went on to the next door. But I still find it just fascinating, and there's no way that the writers translating it could do justice to it. I mean, you could try, right? You could say, they're stingy, they're greedy, and you could have all these words that end with Y, but it's not quite the same. But that's really the impact. And the thing about these lists, you're not really supposed to itemize, and it's a big picture. The fruit of the Spirit is not called the fruits of the Spirit. The things that are listed are called the fruit. In other words, it's just one thing they're trying to say. They're using 8 or 9 or 21 words to say it. It's just, here's the idea you take from it, as opposed to, okay, so let me break down what each one of these means. It's not that you can't do that. It's just what you're going to find is they're all synonyms. They're just rhyming synonyms. Okay, and then you know where we're going. The apocalypse. A great portent appeared in heaven, a woman clothed with the sun. Now, we went to the library, and we've gone toward sci-fi or something. A woman clothed with the sun, with the moon under her feet, and on her head a crown of 12 stars. She was pregnant and was crying out in birth pangs in the agony of giving birth. Then another portent appeared in heaven, a great red dragon with 7 heads and 10 horns and 7 diadems on his heads. His tail swept down 1/3 of the stars of heaven and threw them to the earth. Then the dragon stood before the woman who was about to bear a child, that he might devour her child as soon as it was born. And she gave birth to a son, a male child who is to rule all the nations with a rod of iron. But her child was snatched away and taken to God and to his throne, and the woman fled into the wilderness, where she has a place prepared by God, so that there she could be nourished for 1,260 days. Okay, we went sci-fi, or some such thing. We went into some very creative literature. Well, technically we went into apocalyptic literature. It's a genre. And an apocalypse, that's the first word in the text of the book of Revelation. The first word in the text is apocalypse in Greek. In the English it says the revelation of John, but it says apocalypse of John. So an apocalypse is a genre. It's not what we think of now if you're on Netflix and you go, I don't know, you want to look at something apocalyptic? Because you know that's going to be zombies and something about the end times or whatever. That's not what apocalyptic is. An apocalypse is specifically God's response, pending response, it's delayed, to the injustice that's going on right now, the mess that the earth is in. So we're going to get a glimpse of what God's response is going to be to that which is wrong in the world. It's not happening right away, or else we wouldn't have this stuff. In terms of form, it uses fantastical visions. I mean, the dragon's got this many heads, and the woman's clothed in the sun. I don't know how you wear the sun, you know. Well, I do. You go to the apocalyptic section. You don't go to the science section, right? It's poetry. It's fantastical. In terms of device, the images open up all kinds of possibilities. The woman can be Israel. It can be Mary. It can be the church. In fact, I'd say it is. It can be the dragon. It can be Egypt. It can be Herod. It can be Rome. I'd say it is. That's the way it works. It works on all these levels so that you can engage it and it can engage you and you use your imagination. So when you go in the library, you got to decide, well, what kind of mood are we in here? And if you're not in the imaginative, apocalyptic mood, you're not ready to read it. And if you're in the poetry section and you're expecting history, you're not ready to read it. You've got to pay attention to what section you've gone into in this library that we call the books or the Bible. Okay, so.
Wow.
I know, it was a lot. What's your takeaway? What are you thinking?
I'm thinking I've never thought about it like that.
Good. I wish that Christian education had, from infancy, used that analogy at appropriate stages. I mean, kids aren't ready for all of that, but to educate us that way the whole way. Because I used to tell my class this. If you go to the first grade in February and they talk about President's Day and you're cutting out a stovetop, hat, and you're talking about George and you're talking about Abraham, well, that's fine. It's first grade, it's kindergarten, whatever, that's great. But in the 7th grade, President's Day, and you're talking about these two, you might want to get a little deeper than that, right? And in high school and college, you might write a paper. At some point, you might talk about founding fathers that said all men are created equal and we had slaves, and you complicate it. And you graduate in your complexity. But if in Sunday school and the church, we don't do something like this, and it's still the same at every age. The Pharisees were hypocrites. All the pages of the Bible agree. No. And if we'd introduced the notion of library, we would kind of grow with it. Yeah.
It's interesting because the thing I was thinking throughout most of your presentation was how to convince you and David to write a curriculum for the kids as they receive their Bibles, and then
Well,
part of their Sunday school each year would grow on that.
This year, Katie did something, our new children's and families minister. She gave them the 3rd grade Bible, but she also gave them a companion children's piece written by N.T. Wright, a world-class biblical scholar, to help with how to read it and telling the stories, which I thought was just fantastic. I mean, to me, that's the library. She gave them a librarian along with the book, which is wonderful.
But is that the one they use in their classroom? Is the one by?
I don't know.
Oh, okay. I thought I
don't
heard
know.
that somewhere.
Yep.
Sorry.
I also think of how illogical it is for us to expect it to be one continuous tale and make sense with the context of a whole.
Well, for some that would be very logical, and for some it would be illogical. It just depends on your orientation.
Well, I
Yeah.
come under your spells.
Well, so next week, the harder task, I think, is why. Do y'all know the book Proust and the Squid? Do you know that book?
Heard of
So I'm really quite taken with this author and some of the stuff she's written. And I've been reading a lot about, this is weird, been reading about reading. And so we're going to kind of talk about the magic of reading and how that can be used in Bible. So we'll have fun, I think, I hope. So thanks for coming. Be safe.